Welcome to Life Stories. Today, we bring you a tale of family secrets, betrayal, and the ultimate search for truth. Sophie Harper, a woman caught between the cold expectations of her mother and the love of her late father, embarks on a journey of self-discovery. As a wedding turns into a revelation of shocking truths, Sophie must confront her past and embrace the power she never knew she had. Stay tuned as we explore the profound lessons learned from Sophie's life. Subscribe to Life Stories and let's begin today's story. I sat by the window of the commuter train, the rhythmic hum of the tracks the only sound accompanying my thoughts. The wedding invitation in my hands seemed to pulse with a kind of cruel irony. It had arrived just a few days ago, a grand piece printed on lavender-colored luxury paper, embossed with gold foil. The words boldly announced the marriage of my mother, Carol Harper, to Robert Matthews, an old friend of my father's. I stared at the paper, but my mind was 1,000 miles away. I could barely focus on the words as memories of my father, James, flooded my mind. He had passed away suddenly a year ago, leaving me with a silence that was hard to fill. Dad had been the one constant in my life. He was a successful businessman, the head of Harper Real Estate. Yet at home, he was a gentle soul. He had always made me feel special, reminding me that I was his special child. Those words echoed in my mind as I looked out the window, trying to block the tears that threatened to fall. My father had always been my anchor. And now, just a year after his sudden death from a heart attack, that anchor was gone. The world had shifted on its axis, and nothing seemed to make sense anymore. I had never felt like I fit in with my family. My mother, Carol, was the epitome of perfection. She was well known in social circles, always the picture of elegance, her every gesture marked by grace. But beneath that polished exterior was a woman whose coldness ran deep. She had always been critical of me, constantly comparing me to my younger sister, Jessica, with her model-like looks, her charm, and her ability to make friends wherever she went. Jessica had always been the favorite, the one my mother was proud of, and I was the disappointment, the one who couldn't live up to her expectations. "You always disappoint me, Sophie," my mother's words echoed in my ears. "Why can't you be more like Jessica? You need to improve yourself." It felt like I had heard those words 1,000 times, each one sharper than the last. The sting of her criticism was something I had grown used to, even if it never stopped hurting. Jessica, on the other hand, always seemed to agree with our mother. When I was being criticized, Jessica would nod along, sometimes even adding her own remarks. "Big sister, you're really clumsy. I can't believe you can't even do this properly. If you just tried harder, Mom would surely acknowledge you." It hurt, but I had learned to live with it. My father had been the one to see me, the one who understood the person I was beyond my failures and flaws. I could still hear his voice clearly in my memory. "Someday, all of this will be yours." At the time, I hadn't understood what he meant. But now, in the absence of his guidance, those words took on a deeper meaning. I had never felt so lost, so alone. The train announcement brought me back to the present. Next station, Union Square. I glanced at my reflection in the small mirror I had taken from my bag. My eyes were filled with a deep sadness that I could never quite shake off. Despite the many accolades I had earned as a project manager at Harper Technologies, a prestigious IT company where I was regarded highly by my colleagues and clients, at home, I was still that girl who couldn't live up to my mother's standards. I looked at the invitation once more, my fingers trembling slightly as I held it. The wedding was just a few days away, and even though it was my mother's second marriage, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong about it. Robert Matthews had been a longtime friend of my father's, but I had always suspected that their relationship was deeper than just friendship. My father had known, too, though he never spoke of it directly. He had always tried to protect the family, and I wondered if, in his own way, he had accepted what was happening, knowing it was easier to keep the peace than to confront the truth. The train pulled into the station, and I stood up, feeling the familiar weight of my emotions pressing down on me. As I stepped off the train and into the bustle of the city, My phone buzzed. It was a message from my mother. "I'm busy with wedding preparations. You can come for the latter half of the ceremony. Don't need to be in the photos." The message felt cold, distant, and it cut deeper than anything she had ever said to me. She had never truly seen me. Never truly understood the pain I carried. It was as if I wasn't even part of the family anymore. I sighed, shoving the phone back into my bag. I had become so used to being treated like an outsider that it no longer surprised me. But it still hurt, and it would hurt even more when I walked into that wedding. Only to be met with the same indifference, the same cruelty, but I had no choice. This wedding wasn't just about my mother. It was about the final chapter of a story that had been written without me. A story I had never asked to be a part of but had found myself trapped in nonetheless. As I entered the office building, I focused on my work. For a few hours, I would be able to escape my family, my past, the pain that always seemed to follow me. In the office, I was confident, capable. I had earned the trust of clients and managed complex projects with ease. But in my family, I was still just the daughter who couldn't do anything right. At my desk, I looked at a photo of my father. "This time, I'll live up to your expectations," I whispered, as if he could hear me. But deep down, I knew I was doing this for myself, not for him. The wedding was just a small part of a much larger story. A story that was about to unfold in ways I couldn't even imagine. The day of the wedding arrived, and I could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. The Grand Plaza Hotel in downtown Manhattan was a picture of perfection. Its elegant facade gleaming under the afternoon sun. Inside, the grand banquet hall was filled with the scent of roses and the soft melodies of a piano playing in the background. The pristine white tablecloths and champagne gold ribbons glimmered under the soft light, setting the stage for what was meant to be a celebration. But as I stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a lie. I had arrived, as my mother had instructed, in the latter half of the ceremony. The reception was already in full swing when I entered, and the guests were scattered throughout the room, clinking their champagne glasses and engaging in light conversation. The sight of it all made my stomach churn. But I pushed forward, smoothing out the wrinkles of my navy dress as I moved toward my seat. The invitation had come late, just a week before the wedding, and the message from my mother about attending only half of the ceremony was as clear as it was hurtful. It wasn't just a casual remark, it was a statement of how little I mattered to her. But that was nothing new. It had been that way my whole life. I made my way through the crowd, exchanging polite smiles with a few familiar faces. Old friends of my father. People who I had grown up with. All of them offering me the same look of sympathy that I had grown accustomed to. No one said anything, but the way their eyes lingered on me told me everything. I was the outsider, the one who had never belonged. At the main table, I saw my mother, Carol, sitting beside Robert Matthews, the man she was about to marry. She looked youthful and radiant in her white wedding dress, her beauty undiminished by the years. Robert, her new husband-to-be, sat beside her in a tuxedo, his face a mask of satisfaction. And then there was Jessica, my younger sister, dressed in a champagne pink gown, sitting proudly beside them. The three of them looked like a perfect family, the picture of happiness and unity. A painful ache tightened in my chest as I watched them. A family that had never truly been mine. "Thank you all for being here." My mother's voice rang out through the microphone. Her tone warm, her smile flawless. She spoke briefly about her gratitude for the people who had supported her. But it was when she began speaking about Jessica that something inside me broke. "My beloved daughter, Jessica, without you, this day would not have been possible. It was you who introduced me to Robert. It was you who encouraged and supported our relationship," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The room erupted into applause, and Jessica stood up to embrace our mother, her smile wide and genuine. I felt a bitter taste rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down. It was then that my mother turned toward me. Her gaze fell on me with a brief, almost dismissive glance. "I do have another daughter, don't I?" she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. The room fell silent for a moment. The tension thick in the air. This useless one doesn't matter. She continued, her words echoing in the quiet room. Her laugh, forced and hollow, only served to deepen the wound. But I'm happy thanks to my brilliant younger daughter. She added, still smiling, as though it were all a joke. Jessica joined in, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Big sister, you're really clumsy. I can't believe you can't even do this properly. If you just tried harder, Mom would surely acknowledge you. Her words cut deeper than any knife could. The pain in my chest intensified. And for a moment, I thought I might choke on it. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. But I wiped them away quickly. The people at my table shot me pitying glances. But no one dared to speak up. The damage had already been done. As the ceremony continued and my mother's speech droned on, I felt a strange sense of detachment. As though I were watching it all from a distance. I raised my glass when the toast was made. But I could hardly hear the words of congratulations around me. I felt like a ghost. Invisible to everyone, even my own family. But then something shifted. As the speech ended and the music began to play, a new energy filled the room. I could feel the atmosphere change. The air thick with anticipation. It wasn't the wedding I had expected. It was a turning point. At that moment, the door to the venue opened, and an elderly man in a gray suit stepped inside. He scanned the room with purpose before making his way to the stage. I recognized him immediately. Jonathan Fisher, my father's lawyer, the one who had handled all of my father's legal matters. And I knew, with a sudden clarity, that the moment had arrived. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice calm and steady as he addressed the room. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, he said, his tone formal, but I have an important message to deliver. As the executor of the late James Harper's will, I must read a document that changes everything. The room fell silent. My mother's face turned pale, her eyes wide with confusion. Robert's hand instinctively reached for her, but his grip seemed uncertain. Almost afraid, I stood up from my seat, my heart racing. This was it. The truth was about to come out. The room held its breath as Jonathan Fisher began to speak. The tension in the air palpable. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I stood there. My hands trembling slightly. The reality of the situation was starting to sink in. This was no longer just about a wedding or a family gathering. It was about something far more significant. My father's final gift to me. The truth that had been buried for so long was about to be exposed. Jonathan held up a black leather binder, its contents heavy with secrets. This, he began, his voice firm, is the last will and testament of James Harper. He paused for a moment, allowing his words to settle in the room. My mother's face turned ashen, and I could see the color drain from Robert's face as well. Jessica, ever the picture of composure, seemed to be the only one who hadn't fully grasped the weight of the situation. Jonathan continued, his voice steady as he read aloud. For years, I have turned a blind eye to the abuse of my eldest daughter, Sophie, by my wife and younger daughter. To atone for this sin, all my assets are transferred to my eldest daughter, Sophie Harper. The diary and recordings I have kept as evidence of my wife's infidelity are being held by my lawyer. The words echoed through the room like a thunderclap. My heart raced. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel all eyes on me. The room falling into an eerie silence. I looked at my mother, her eyes wide with disbelief. And then at Robert, whose face had gone pale. Jessica, standing beside them, looked equally stunned, her hand shaking slightly as she clutched the back of her chair for support. No, my mother finally whispered, her voice trembling with anger and fear. This is a mistake. This is a forgery. Her voice broke on the word, forgery, and she took a step toward Jonathan, pointing a trembling finger at the will in his hands. This isn't real. We've already completed the division of the inheritance, she shouted, her voice rising in a frantic pitch. Jonathan remained calm, unfazed by her outburst. Mrs. Harper, he said quietly, this is an official will, created by your husband 2 weeks before his death. It has notary certification, and it is legally binding. It is the latest and most valid will. The air in the room seemed to thicken, as though time itself had slowed. My mother's face turned a sickly shade of white, and Robert, standing at her side, placed a hand on her shoulder. Though his own expression was one of doubt, he looked at her with a mix of confusion and suspicion. "Margaret," he began, his voice strained. "What is this about? I thought you told me your relationship with James had already grown cold. You told me it was natural for us to be together after his death." My mother's eyes darted nervously. She opened her mouth to speak but quickly closed it. Her face flushed with panic. She couldn't find the words to justify her actions. Not when the evidence was so undeniable. Jonathan, however, was not done. He pulled out another document from the binder and read aloud once more. On February 15, 2023, Margaret Harper and Robert Matthews met in a suite at the Plaza Hotel. They stayed from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. A gasp rippled through the room as the truth began to sink in. My mother's face was bright red, and she stumbled backward, nearly losing her balance. "This isn't possible," she muttered, shaking her head. "It's not true." Jonathan was unfazed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small recorder, its black casing glinting under the lights. He pressed a button, and the voice of my mother crackled to life in the room. "He doesn't have long," she said on the recording, her voice cold and calculating. "James is getting weaker every day. We have to make our move now." The sound of my mother's voice on that recording was like a knife to my heart. She had betrayed my father in the most cruel and calculated way. As the recording played, I saw the shock on Robert's face, his eyes wide as he realized the depth of the lies he had been swept up in. He took a step away from my mother, his face contorted with disbelief. "Is this true?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. My mother remained silent, her head bowed in shame. She couldn't deny it. The truth had come to light in the most public and undeniable way. "I knew," I said softly, my voice cutting through the heavy silence in the room. "Father knew everything, how you treated me, how you betrayed him with Robert. He kept quiet for so long, for fear of breaking up the family. But in the end, he chose justice." I turned to face my mother, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "You should have known, Mom. You should have known that he would never forgive you for this." Margaret's eyes burned with anger, a mixture of fear and rage flashing in her gaze. "You incited this, didn't you? You made him do this." She spat, her voice venomous. "You ungrateful child." I shook my head slowly. "I didn't make him do anything. This is what he wanted. This is his legacy." The tension in the room was unbearable as the guests began to murmur among themselves. Some were leaving, unable to bear the weight of the revelation. My mother's grip on Robert's arm tightened, but even he seemed uncertain. His eyes filled with doubt as he looked at her for the first time. In that moment, I knew my life was about to change forever. The truth had been unveiled, and with it, everything I had once feared and resented came crashing down. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had my father's will, and with it, I had the power to take control of my own future. As the final echoes of Jonathan's reading faded into the stillness of the room, I stood tall, feeling a strange sense of liberation wash over me. The weight I had carried for so long, the years of being unseen, unheard, and unloved, had lifted in an instant. My mother's betrayal, Robert's complicity, Jessica's silent agreement, they were no longer the shadows that had haunted me. In that moment, I understood what my father had meant when he said, "You will be mine, Sophie." His love, his protection, his final gift to me, had given me the strength to stand up, not just for myself, but for the truth. The guests, those who remained, whispered among themselves, unsure of how to react to the storm that had just passed through their midst. But none of that mattered anymore. I had nothing to prove. No more waiting for acknowledgement from a family that had never truly seen me. The future was mine to shape, and I would do so with the power my father had given me. As I walked out of the Grand Plaza Hotel, the world seemed different. The air was clearer, the sky bluer, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I belonged. It was a new beginning, my own. Independent of the ties that had once bound me to a broken family. Thank you for following Sophie's story. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more tales of transformation, redemption, and the power of truth. See you in the next video.